on the morning of July 16, 1945, are carried up the gangway of the cruiser USS Indianapolis and welded to the deck of the captain's own quarters. Armed officers stand over it, day and night. No one aboard is told what it is, not even the captain. He has orders to guard it with us down. The cargo goes into a lifeboat first, ahead of any man. The crate holds the core of the atomic bomb that will destroy Hiroshima. And the man guarding it has 18 days left before his navy turns on him. You may know this ship from a single famous speech in a famous movie, a grizzled shark hunter in the film Jaws, telling the story of men in the water and the fins closing in. It has been retold so often it has become a kind of campfire legend. But legends deserve a second, harder look. Because the true story of the USS Indianapolis is worse than the legend, and it does not end in the water. It ends in a courtroom and on a front lawn in Connecticut 23 years later. The captain was Charles Butler McVay III, Naval Academy son of an admiral, a calm and competent officer who had already won a Silver Star under fire. The Indianapolis, hull number CA-35, was a proud ship. She had been Admiral Spruance's flagship and once carried the president himself. McVay delivered his secret cargo to the island of Tinian, where the bomb would be assembled, on July 26th. The hardest, most dangerous job of his life was, he believed, behind him. In fact, it had not yet begun. His orders sent him next toward the Philippines, alone across open ocean, without escort. Before we go further, if untold history like this is what you came for, subscribe. It helps keep these coming, because the word alone is where this story turns. McVay had asked for an escort. He was told he did not need one, and what the Navy knew about the waters ahead of him, and never told him, is the heart of everything that followed. Here is the first buried fact. American codebreakers had been reading Japanese naval signals, and intelligence indicated enemy submarines were operating along the very route the Indianapolis would sail. That information was so secret that it was not passed to McVay. He set out across the Philippine Sea, believing the lane ahead was reasonably safe, under orders that allowed him to stop zigzagging at his discretion in poor visibility. He was sailing blind into a trap his own navy could see, and chose not to show him. Just after midnight on July 30th, 1945, in the dark of the Philippine Sea, a Japanese submarine, the I-58, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto, caught the dark shape of a warship crossing that name, Hashimoto. He will matter more to McVay's fate than any American admiral. The submarine maneuvered into a near-perfect firing position and put a spread of torpedoes into the water. There was no warning. The first explosion tore the bow, nearly off the Indianapolis. The cruiser is mortally hit in seconds. The second torpedo strikes near the center of the ship, and the sea pours in. Power failed. The order to abandon ship can barely be passed. In the chaos and the dark, the Indianapolis rolls onto her side, and 12 minutes from a quiet night in roughly 12 minutes. 12 minutes from a quiet night watch to a ship gone of nearly 1,200 men aboard. Around 300 go down with her or die in those first minutes. The rest, close to 900, are suddenly in the open ocean. And here her radio operators sent distress calls. As the ship died, the Navy maintained that no clear SOS had ever gone out. It was not true. Distress signals were received at American shore stations and acted on by no one. At one station, the officer was asleep and had ordered he not be disturbed. At another, the message was dismissed as a Japanese trick. The men in the water did not know it, but their one chance at a fast rescue had just been ignored on land. No one was coming. No one even knew they were gone. Worse, the Indianapolis was not reported overdue. Under a quirk of Navy procedure, the arrival of combatant ships was not tracked the way other vessels were, and when she failed to reach Leyte on schedule, no alarm was raised. A ship of nearly 1,200 men had vanished, and the United States Navy did not notice for 3.5 days. The survivors were on their own in the Philippine Sea with no boats, little water, and the sun coming up. Picture it from the water. Hundreds of men in scattered groups, many badly burned, most in nothing but life jackets, clinging together in the swells. The kapok vests were never meant to float a man for days. Slowly they waterlogged and dragged. There was almost no fresh water. The tropical sun blistered them by day. At night they shivered until their teeth cracked, and below them, drawn by the sound and the blood, the open ocean sharks began to gather. What followed is remembered as the largest shark attack in recorded history. Oceanic whitetips and others moved through the groups for days. The survivors learned to bunch tight, to push the dead away from the living, to go silent and still when the fins came near. The exact toll the sharks took will never be known. Exposure and salt water killed many more, but the terror of those days marked every man who lived through them for the rest of his life. We will not dwell on the details. The survivors lived them. They do not need reenacting. By the second and third days, thirst did what the sharks could not. Desperate men drove them into delirium. Some saw islands that were not there and swam off toward them. Some believed the ship was just below and dived for it. Others, hallucinating, turned on the men beside them. Officers and senior sailors tried to hold their little flotillas together by force of will, talking, praying, counting heads as the count fell. Each dawn there were fewer of them. Rescue, when it came by pure accident. A Navy patrol anti-submarine flight, piloted by Lieutenant Wilbur Gwynn, happened to spot an oil slick, and then heads, hundreds of heads, bobbing in the sea below. He had no idea who they were. No one had reported anyone missing. He radioed it in, and the machinery of rescue finally, belatedly, lurched into motion. The men had been in the water for roughly 4 days. One pilot turned belated luck into heroism. Lieutenant Adrian Marks flew his PBY flying boat to the scene, and when he saw men being taken by sharks below him, he made a decision against standing orders. He landed his aircraft on the open ocean swells, a dangerous, often forbidden maneuver, and began pulling survivors aboard, lashing them to the wings when the cabin filled. Ships converged through the night. By the time it was over, the rescuers had pulled out the living and counted the cost. Of the roughly 1,200 men who had sailed, only about 316 came home. It was, and remains, the worst single loss of life at sea in the history of the United States Navy. The disaster broke into the news at a strange moment. The announcement of the survivors' rescue was nearly drowned out by the announcement of Japan's surrender. The war ended, the nation celebrated, and inside the Navy Department a different conversation had already begun. Not how 900 men had been left to die, but who could be made to answer for it. The answer they chose was the man who had nearly died with them. McVay had survived. Thrown into the sea when his ship rolled, he had spent the same days adrift as his men on a small raft and was among the last group rescued. He had given the order to abandon ship. He had been one of the last off her. The survivors, to a man, did not blame him. They knew what he could not have known. But the institution above him needed a name to put on the disaster. And a captain who lives is far more useful for that than a captain who dies. In December of 1945, the war won. The United States Navy did something it had never done before and has never done since. It court-martialed a captain for losing ships to an act of war. In the entire history of the U.S. Navy, hundreds of ships have been sunk by the enemy. Charles McVay is the only commanding officer ever put on trial for it. The charge that would stick was narrow and technical. That he had hazarded his ship by failing to zigzag, failing to steer the random evasive course, meant to throw off a submarine's aim. Look at what that single charge accomplished. By putting the whole disaster on one tactical choice by one man, the Navy drew the eye away from everything else. The escort it refused him, the submarine warning it with Nord, the 4 days it took to notice he was gone. All of it vanished behind one word: zigzag. It was, in effect, a trial designed not to find the truth, but to contain it. And then the Navy did something that stunned the public and has stunned historians ever since. It brought the enemy to Washington to testify against an American captain. Mochitsura Hashimoto, the Japanese submarine commander who had fired the torpedoes that killed the Indianapolis, was flown to the United States and put on the stand at McVay's court-martial. The country was outraged. The man who sank the ship called as a witness for the prosecution against the man who lost it. But Hashimoto did not give the Navy what it wanted. Under questioning, he testified that his firing position had been so favorable that zigzagging would have made no difference. He would have sunk her either way. He was not alone in saying it. The Navy's own submarine experts agreed. One of America's most experienced submarine commanders testified that zigzagging was of negligible value against a determined attacker in a good position, that the maneuver McVay was charged with neglecting would likely have saved no one. The enemy and the experts told the same story. The loss was not the captain's failure. It was the war and a chain of decisions made far above him, and the court convicted him anyway. McVay was found guilty of failing to zigzag. The court did quietly, remitted the sentence and restored him to duty. He would even retire, years later, as a rear admiral. But the conviction stood on his record, and it did its work. The official verdict of the United States Navy was that the loss of the Indianapolis and the deaths of 900 men were, in some measure, the fault of Charles McVay. He would carry that sentence long after the Navy stopped enforcing it. Why him, and why so hard? One theory, raised by the author Richard Newcomb and echoed by McVay's own family, points to the powerful chief of naval operations, Admiral Ernest King, a man famous for never forgetting a grudge, and who, the family believed, held an old one against McVay's father. Whether that is the full truth or not, the broader motive is plainer. A grieving nation wanted an answer for 900 dead sons and then be one captain, rather than the institution itself. What the court-martial began, the families finished. Year after year, McVay received letters from the parents and widows of his lost crew, letters that held him personally responsible for their dead, that arrived at Christmas, that never stopped. Imagine a man already carrying 900 ghosts, opening his mail to be told, again and again, that he was their murderer. He had survived the sea. He could not survive the blame. The conviction had given the grief a name and an address, and the cruelty followed him home. Not everyone abandoned him. The survivors of the Indianapolis, the men who had been in that water with him, never wavered, and many spent the rest of their lives insisting their skipper had been wronged. They held reunions. They wrote letters of their own, to the Navy, to Congress, to anyone who would listen. For decades it went nowhere. The verdict was on the books, and the books do not move easily. The men who loved McVay grew old watching the injustice stand. The weight finally became too much. In 1968, after years of grief and a public verdict that branded him guilty of his own men's deaths, Charles McVay took his own life at his home in Connecticut. He was 70 years old. He was found holding a small toy sailor, a figure he had kept since he was a boy, long before the academy, before the war, before the night the sea opened under his ship. It is, perhaps, the saddest image in this entire story, the Admiral's son, at the end, holding the toy of the boy who first dreamed of going to sea. And here the story would have ended. A captain wrongly blamed, dead by his own hand, the truth sealed in old documents and the memories of dying men. The survivors were aging out. The Navy had no intention of revisiting a 60-year-old verdict. The injustice was, by every reasonable measure, permanent. It would take someone with no rank, no authority, and no idea that what he was attempting was supposed to be impossible. It would take a child. In 1996, an 11-year-old boy in Pensacola, Florida, named Hunter Scott, watched the movie Jaws with his father and heard that same famous monologue about the men in the water and the sharks. He turned to his father and asked a simple question: was that real? They began to research, and Hunter chose the sinking of the USS Indianapolis as his school history project. He placed an ad in the newspaper asking survivors to contact him. He expected a few replies. He was buried in them. What started as a school project became a crusade. Hunter Scott eventually interviewed nearly 150 survivors and pored over roughly 800 documents. The survivors, who had spent 50 years being ignored, poured their hearts and their saved papers into the hands of a child who would listen. And in those declassified records, the truth the 1945 court had been steered around sat in black and white. The withheld submarine warnings, the ignored distress calls, the impossibility of the zigzag charge. A boy with a library card had assembled the case the Navy never wanted made. The story is told in full in Doug Stanton's book In Harm's Way and in the survivor's own testimony to Congress. Hunter Scott's research, carried by a congressman who took up the cause, became the basis of a federal resolution. And one more voice spoke for McVay from the far side of the war. Mochitsura Hashimoto, the enemy commander, now an old man, wrote in support of clearing the captain's name, repeating what he had said in 1945, that no maneuver could have saved the ship. The man who sank the Indianapolis stood, at the end, on the same side. In October of 2000, the Congress of the United States passed a resolution declaring that Captain Charles McVay's record should reflect that he was exonerated for the loss of the USS Indianapolis. The President signed it. The Navy amended his file. It came 32 years after his death and 55 years after the verdict. Too late for the man, but not for the truth. Today, the USS Indianapolis National Memorial stands in the city whose name she bore, inscribed with the names of her crew, and the wreck herself was found at last in 2017, resting upright on the floor of the Philippine Sea, 3.5 miles down. An institution can admit a mistake the moment it happens, when admission costs the most and helps the most, or it can wait until everyone who was wronged is beyond the reach of the apology. The Navy chose to wait, and a captain died inside that delay. The lesson of the Indianapolis is not that the sea is cruel. The sea is only the sea. It is that the people we trust to be just are sometimes the slowest of all to be just, and that it can fall to a survivor, or a stranger, or an 11-year-old to make them. Whether McVay's court-martial was justice or scapegoating is, even now, argued. But the United States Congress has rendered its verdict, and so have the men who were in the water. If your father, your grandfather, your uncle, anyone in your family served in the Pacific in any branch, leave their name and one thing about them in the comments. Don't just leave a name. Tell us one thing they did or said or that you remember. The men who were there deserve more than a line in a database. Subscribe if you want the next story. There are more of them.